Good morning, Penn State fans. It's Wednesday, April 9, and Penn State is at the halfway mark of spring practice. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle from Blue White Illustrated, bluewhiteillustrated.com, your home for the latest Penn State athletics news. Obviously, football is top of mind as we get to the halfway point of spring practice here in early April. The men's hockey team is getting ready to play in the Frozen Four on Thursday. T. Frank, and Penn State opened up its third practice of the spring for reporters to get a look at things before the interviews took place. So we got a lot coming for you on today's show. We're going to give you some thoughts on what we've learned and what maybe we haven't learned during the first half of spring ball. We're going to get into some thoughts on the Penn State running back situation. Heard some really good stuff from James Franklin on Tuesday night about Stan Drayton and the role he has in the process of taking over for Jaywan Sider and trying to take two already extremely talented running backs, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, to the next level. So we'll get into all that and much more on today's show. T. Frank, though, good morning. We are rolling along. It's hard to believe that it is already the midway point of spring
Doesn't
practice.
feel like it.
Doesn't feel like it one bit, but that's where we're at. The blue-white game is quickly approaching. Penn State still has there's some info about what that'll look like. A lot of it's going to come the week of, but T. Frank, how are we doing this morning?
I wish I didn't have my heater on. And I wish I didn't have to go with the Steve Jobs look wearing the long sleeve shirt in April. But I was driving home last night from practice. It's 8:30. There's still that like tint of light in the sky. You know,
right.
That's when you know summer is almost here. It's just around the corner when
right.
You got that feeling of like daylight is infinite. And I got my heated seats on in the car and I'm like still cold. I don't want to start with a weather update, but also
right.
That sucks. That's a bummer. So other than that, it doesn't feel like we're halfway through spring ball, but we're into the spring sports schedule, which means a bunch of different things are happening, outside of football as well, where you've got the transfer portal happening in a week from today. You've got playoffs and a lot of national sports. And of course, the Final Four. Greg, how was it? Greg went out to the Final Four and watched all of the three final games, right?
Yeah, a good trip to San Antonio, T. Frank, 3 good basketball games, and obviously your 2025 national champs in hoops are the Florida Gators. So, no, it was a great trip. I can't recommend San Antonio enough. Can't recommend the Final Four enough. Always a great time. It's interesting to compare that event to the college wrestling championships, which we were at a couple weeks ago, obviously, and then the college football playoffs and the semifinals. They all have a little bit of a different way in which they run. This one, of course, run very well by the NCAA, as it's been for years. Like I said, 3 very good games. And yeah, it was a little chillier in San Antonio some of the days than I thought it was going to be. And then some days it was exactly as hot as I anticipated it being. So a little bit of a Pennsylvania weather vibe down there for sure, just in that regard where the weather's a little bit unpredictable, even though for the most part, you know what you're going to get. Some days catch up on you. So no, it was a good trip. Happy to be back though. And like you said, it's an interesting time on the sports calendar because there's a lot going on in some respects and there's nothing going on in other respects, just depending on what you like. So if you're not into pro hockey, pro baseball, or the major league or hockey, basketball, or baseball at the pro level, you're really running out of college events to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
And so, of course, games, not the transfer portal, not recruiting, those things go on all year round. But in terms of just games themselves, running out of time there. So fun part of the calendar, the Masters is this week. I know a lot of people are excited about that. Golf tournament kicks off Thursday in Augusta.
There's so many things I don't pay attention to. So many things. It's amazing.
Say that again, T. Frank.
I said did I freeze? Did I freeze again?
It's actually on me. So next time once you get into some of your practice thought time, I'm going to do something with my internet and we'll be back in business.
Yeah. So let's just get into it then. We'll start in on the Penn State practice update once I find my nifty intro here, and you can get all that squared away. Great.
All right. I think we're back in business. Does everything sound and look good to you?
It looked good to me, but that's never
right.
been. That's a false flag sometimes, where that means nothing on my end. But it looks like we're good. You are moving again, so that's great.
All right. Well, so far, so good on this end of things. If you all in the comments, thanks for being with us here on Wednesday morning, April 9th for the BWI live show. If you see any audio, video glitches from us, please be sure to let us know. Same with the podcast, folks. Obviously, most of you are listening to this on replay, but always appreciate your feedback. And don't remember to like and subscribe wherever you are getting the show from.
5 stars.
All right, T. Frank.
Always helpful.
5 stars. Always, yes. Penn State had another open practice on Tuesday night. This one a little bit different than what was presented the first time in terms of what we were able to see during the handful of practice periods that we were in Holuba Hall for in other weeks. So let's just start out. Initial thoughts on what you saw. Penn State, of course, with the way the state college weather has been since we have been, the 3 practices we have been to, plenty of work indoors instead of outdoors.
Yeah, that's, it's funny. A lot of times I'll even start my updates with a weather report because it matters what we see. If you can see in the background of some of the highlights I'm playing here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel, the D line and the O line are on what is the south side of Holuba Hall. We're on the north side. So you not only have 53 1/3 yards between you and them, you also have 100 players. And so it's difficult sometimes to see what's going on with the offensive line in that respect. And that's just kind of a caveat for what we'll talk about. There's been probably less news about the D-line in particular because of that. Tried to give my best eyeball and my camera lens to see the offensive line because I've been spending a lot of time with the offense this spring. But that is just kind of a function of what's going on based on the weather. But one thing I did notice, and you might see some of that here on the highlight package, is that the complexity of what they were doing ramped up this week. So instead of having receivers run routes, solo, single route, and quarterback, they started doing pass patterns together. They started working on offensive linemen joining together to run, blocking with the quarterbacks and the running backs and some run game shells and things like that. And then on the defensive side, it felt like the complexity of what we saw, at least, remembering that they have 2 other practices that we don't see, and they have majority of the practice that we don't see, even on Tuesdays. It just seemed like the complexity of what we saw ramped up, where they started working on more combined drills of putting the defense together so that everyone's starting to understand the nuances of their positions, not just position fundamentals and what do I do in X situation. It's what do we do together on the defensive side. It made for a lot more standing around. So for the offense, it means they're doing more complex things together. And the defense, it means we're all going a quarter speed, working through this, doing some walkthroughs, trying to understand the mental aspect of defense. And so that was kind of the color of what we got from practice on, as you mentioned, halfway point. Felt like the IQ level ramped up of what they were trying to accomplish. And James Franklin has talked about this being like a curriculum, right? So you start with the basics and then you build and you build and you build till you get to more complex stuff. And that felt like that was the turn this week from what we saw. On the downside, we did not get to see any one-on-ones, which has been very illustrative, illuminating, and obviously if you take too much from it, it can be kind of misleading, but it has given us a wider view of what we didn't see last year or in years past when it comes to the spring football assessment, especially of the wide receivers and defensive backs, and to a brief degree from what I saw last week, the D-line and the O-line. So that was the trade-off. I got to see a little bit more of what the offense and the defense were cooking up. But we got to see less of X is standing out because Y.
Yeah, and sometimes that's the way these things go when Penn State gets to a certain point of especially spring practice to preseason camp to some degree, but at the halfway point of preseason camp, you're going toward game week basically at that point, whereas spring, you might be going towards a slightly different thing because you're still focusing on yourself. So as you know, Penn State really focusing on some of the deeper parts, I guess you could say, of its offense or defense here as the midway point of spring arrives. And just in terms of the vibe, and this is I don't want to get too far ahead on Stan Drayton, but he's a part of the vibe conversation, I think.
Yeah.
I was not in town for the practice yesterday. We'll be the rest of the way here as we get into the second half of spring. But the 2 I was at, I'm sure it was very similar last night. It's very workmanlike. There's not a whole lot of hooting, hollering, carrying on. There's Stan Drayton's demonstrative, but he's not the loudest person I've ever heard talk. But just in general, it's the way,
right?
Yep.
It's the way he speaks. It certainly commands a level of attention from his running back charges, and it's not I would say it's not aggressive in terms of demeaning or anything like that, but it is absolutely specific and intentional. And so like that intensity and that focus brings watching him brings clarity of what I understand what he wants from them. So they obviously understand what he wants from them. And I would say that there is a how do I put this? It's there is a standard that he wants, and he is not going to waver from that. And if you don't meet that, he will tell you about it. So I think there's a little bit of that. And like you said, getting into some of those things that we talked about a little bit later, we'll get into what that means for these players later on. But the other thing that I noticed from practice on the offensive side, Peter Gonzalez running routes again. So the way he started camp, he was doing individual drills. So, agility drills, going through the basics of getting your footwork to know how to cut. And now he's actually doing the routes. And so that's an important step for him as a guy who is recovering from an injury and needs this time, really needs that work, because he's a guy with a big, tall, lean frame who needs to work on his route running and needs to work on the positional skills. It's great to have the mental reps of watching other people and listening to the coaching and understanding conceptually what they want. It's another thing to get your body used to doing it. So running routes is a big thing for him, and I think it was a good step for him. Now, we don't know, because we didn't see one-on-ones if he was a part of those. We don't know what the extent of that was, but I thought he looked pretty good running a couple of routes last night. It was not extensive, but just on that receiver conversation and the obsession about that position, I think he looked pretty good. Another guy, and this is just kind of like random call-outs at this point of other things I've noticed, I think Alex Birchmeier looks pretty good. Like you saw him on, he was 63 in one of the highlights I did get to the offensive line. I think he's looking a little more confident. He's looking a little more in command of his own body, a little less tentative. And I've noticed that from him when I've seen him doing drills. So that's a good thing. Now, the broader context of how that's all working together, we don't know, but it is a noticeable step for him as opposed to years past. I don't think that even that doesn't even mean he's in the too deep right now. It just means that he is eligible to be in the conversation at this point. So that's a positive side. Those are the kind of the things off the top of my head that I remember from last week. And then individually, LeVar Arrington got a chance to watch the defense a little bit more. LeVar Arrington II got a lot of individual coaching from Jim Knowles. He got some of his teammates, in his ear about things he needs to understand when he's doing some of those drills and coverage and doing drops. He just looks raw. So there's positive things. You see encouraging things about a guy who's like, oh, he's never done this before, and it looks clunky, but he still moves really well, and it seems like he's picking these things up, but it is from the very starting point in some of those things. So hopefully that puts the expectations and the hype for him into perspective for fans, that, there's a lot of things to like. There's a lot of things he could do and flash and be encouraging, but he's not Abdul Carter, and he's not on the trajectory of playing and starting his freshman season, at least at this point from what I've seen of him.
Yeah. And he will be a guy followed closely no matter what, because of his name, because of his obviously high school results, and also, of course, the number he wears now for Penn State. T. Frank, before we move into Between the Lines, just any final thoughts from Penn State? Open practice number 3, they will be back on the field later this week. We will not be there, but of course we will be back at Holuba Hall next week.
Trying to think. It just comes back to two things. One of them is just the overall impression I get of the offense, which we're going to get into a little bit later, but I'm getting more of a sense of what the offense is, the personality and some of the tweaks might be for this upcoming season. And I think I'm encouraged by that. I think it makes sense. And then from an individual perspective, it's hard not to notice Kobe Howard. He's a freshman, and you don't want to go too far when we're watching individual drills and skeleton passing formations. But the way he runs routes, the way he looks physically, his build, his consistency in practice, very few drops that we've observed, it's just all really encouraging. And it's a positive sign that Penn State is going to get some guys in the room that aren't going to have this very long arc of development. Now, like Arrington and these other young players we're talking about, nothing now says they're going to actually contribute in the fall. But you're talking about what's the baseline, what's the impression here of where they're starting from. And I think we have a very firm picture that Kobe Howard is starting further ahead than any receiver we've seen from Penn State in recent history. And that's super encouraging.
Yes, and it'll be even more encouraging if he can find his way onto the field. And, of course, if this Penn State receivers room can take a step forward. Let's move into the next segment of today's BWI Live show. It is James Franklin is featured in this one, Between the Lines, where you hear from the head coach of the Nittany Lions, and we tell you what we're hearing based on what he has to say.
They have both gotten reps with runs.
All right, T. Frank. So we teased this a couple of minutes ago on today's show, but one of the more interesting, I think, answers that James Franklin gave on Friday night, or Tuesday night rather, when he talked for about 10 minutes, focused on the running backs, and in particular Stan Drayton's integration into this Penn State football program. Obviously, there's two top running backs, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, had one position coach for their entire career here. The same goes for the younger guys, albeit, of course, for not the same amount of time. All recruited by Jaywan Siders, so there was going to be a natural, relationship growing process that had to happen. It sounds like things are going well on that front, and there were some other thoughts James Franklin had on Stan Drayton, too. You're going to hear him here right now.
Before he transitioned to being the head coach at Temple, who's considered the best running back coach in college football and has got a resume, that backs that up, especially when you talk about guys that he's coached at Villanova, at Ohio State, at Texas. It's an impressive list of NFL players and Hall of Fame players. He played the position, so just a lot of experience there. Has done a really nice job, and has done a good job connecting with a room that was going to be a challenge. And obviously, that they had the same running backs coach their entire career, so those changes are hard. But they seem to be embracing it, and so does Stan. I think Stan's having fun. As you guys heard me talk about, sometimes this head coaching stuff, there's some wonderful aspects to it, but there's also the challenge that it takes you away from the thing you fell in love with in the beginning, which is coaching the guys and having your own position. So I think he's enjoying that as well.
T. Frank, pretty interesting thoughts there from James Franklin on Stan Drayton and his arrival at Penn State. What are your thoughts, reactions to that?
Yeah, so he also, in the question before, was asked about Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. Where can they get better specifically so they can take a step in their progression as players? And he mentioned Katron Allen as a guy who needs to get bigger and more explosive. He's done that in the weight room, and that's a positive sign for Penn State, and very encouraged by his progress there. And you can see it, just in the highlights. He does look a little more explosive. He's always been great physical through contact, having a lot of the building blocks that makes a good running back. It's just about that finishing touch, that secret sauce on top. And then on the flip side, Nick Singleton, he runs like a hammer that only sees nails. And the point is to get Nick Singleton to be a more well-rounded running back. It's not just about what he can physically do and not do in terms of stylistically, but it's about getting him to be more creative and see the field as not just a snowplow, but as somebody who can use multiple abilities to generate those explosive runs of 70, 80 yards, because they have had an issue consistently of getting these running backs to the safety, the unblocked defender, and getting 12 yards. If they make that player miss, it's a touchdown. There's no question about it. Having watched the film, having seen the coach's film, if they break those tackles, Penn State scores 7 extra points. And that's the difference between a Saquon Barkley and scoring 60 against Pitt a couple years ago and these progressive games that feel like they're a slog that eventually snowball into a win, but not getting those knockout blows early in games as well. And that's a lot of what Stan Drayton focuses on, watching some of his coaching clinics over the years that he's given. He's big about keeping guys off the legs of his running backs and using moves, using a plan that's designed to keep you upright, to keep you off the ground. And so that's what those drills are all about. playing through contact, understanding where the contact is coming from, and keeping it away from your legs. And just as somebody, because I wanted to save this for, this point, Tyke Hayes is really good at that. You saw on some of those highlights where he's able to get his shoulder down near his hip and like keep his balance and go through the ball drill or go through the bag. Those are big things in terms of generating extra yards that don't have anything to do with speed or explosiveness. And it builds a well-rounded back if you've already got those skills. So it's just been a really interesting process of watching a different way of doing stuff. And not to say that Jaywan Sider didn't focus on important things and contact balance and power through contact. And he had some drills of, drive and making sure that you could break through arm tackles. But this is about, I think it's giving them a more well-rounded education from how, you stay upright and go through some of that contact, which is the number one job of a running back.
And I think the other thing, James, and this came up in the chat earlier, but James Franklin, as a part of this running back conversation, but not that answer necessarily that we played here. What you're talking about is, he said he wants Nick Singleton more 80 and 90-yard runs. Well, obviously, that's a high bar. Yes, it's a little bit of hyperbole, but it's more to me about Nick Singleton was fifth in the country or tied for fifth in the country with 5 runs of 40 or more last year. Well, what if 2 of those become 50 or more? What does that do differently? And that's what you're getting at here. But so just interesting to see that. And then this kid, this is going to come up here in a little bit, but this continued idea, T. Frank, that it's Kaytron Allen's first healthy offseason and that he is going to make big strides because of that. Just very interested in that and what you think it can mean for him. And I know some of what you just said is what it can mean for him, but we've seen guys before who went through a lot of time off the field at this time of year. And, what can it do for a guy to be out there, especially at this point of his career, where most of the guys his age and most of the guys with his talent are taking an opposite, kind of backseat approach.
So the interesting thing, and I'll put some specifics to this. So I've studied this a little bit in the offseason. During the playoffs, when both these guys were healthy again, and, healthy relative to playing 16 games, I looked at the number of explosive plays in the playoffs because that's when Penn State's run game was really churning. And Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen were both in the top 10 in terms of running backs in the postseason with the number of yards on 10-plus runs. But Singleton or Allen had the lowest average of yardage on those big runs. So, he was ripping off a 20-yard run and getting tackled. He wasn't ripping off those 40-yard runs or getting, down to the 1-yard line. He was getting 12 yards on an explosive run of 10 yards. So that's what it's about. It's about making, and I would disagree that it is about making those 80-yard runs and having those knockout punches. You're not because here's the thing is you might only get 2 or 3 more, but they might end a game and then you come out of the game. And so you don't get 2 more because you've created an environment where now the backups are in and you don't have to get some of the wear and tear off the tires just because you've won the game. We haven't seen Penn State able to put teams away early in a way that allows, even if you want the practice of coming out in the third quarter for the starting offense, they get a drive. And then the rest of the game is just mop up duty. And, that can come from the passing game. And it has in the past, but they don't have the DNA over the last couple of years to make that happen. So the running backs have to be able to generate that. And that's really been the missing piece in this offense has been not just good plays, game-changing plays, game-ending plays. They haven't been able to generate those to, kind of get that final hurdle. And so I think Kaytron Allen being able to do it, Nick Singleton being able to do it on either side of that athletic coin is important. Whoever gets there, gets there.
Right. Penn State would be happy, obviously, and so would all of you watching and listening to this show if at least one of those guys got there. And if both get there, Penn State fans are really going to like what they see this fall, and so is the Penn State coaching staff. I'm going to go out of order here, T. Frank, just to stay on the same side of the ball. But, excuse me. One other position conversation that was had yesterday is, of course, one that will have an impact on this team at some point this year. Drew Aller is the leader in the clubhouse. As we talked about on previous shows, the old quote from Colts offensive coordinator, whose name escapes me at the moment, but basically said we don't practice. We don't practice for situations that are pretty much where we have no shot in anyway.
We don't practice effed. Yeah,
yes,
I think
correct.
it was
Yeah. Tom Moore.
Tom Moore.
About
Yeah.
regarding he was asked about the backup quarterbacks getting more snaps behind Peyton Manning, and the response was that with what T. Frank just said. In that, we don't practice that situation because if you get into it, good luck trying to figure it out anyway. But that does not mean the QB2 battle is not important to Penn State and to its fans, especially this spring. And James Franklin was asked about where things stand on that front on Tuesday night.
Yeah, Jackson's done a heck of a job. We didn't really know coming off injury where he would be, but both of them are doing really well. And that's not coach speak, they're both doing very, very well. So I think this is going to be a competition that's going to go on for a while. I thought Jackson would come off the injury a little rusty. He has not been. Both of them are playing really well. So we got to continue to build on that.
Good news for Jackson Smolik. Obviously, he was able to do some stuff last year, T. Frank, later in the year in terms of some pregame warm-up stuff, some either light or non-contact stuff at practice. But I think we all knew that despite Ethan Grunkemeyer going to the front of the quarterback number 2 line when Bo Prabula transferred, this competition was always going to happen. And it sounds like it's going well for both of these guys. And it's good. Again, it's good news for Jackson Smolik. You always hate when a guy has to miss a year for any reason, specifically due to injury that suffered early in the year. But and you never know how that bounce back is going to go. But at least for him, it sounds like it's going quite well.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I haven't paid I shouldn't say a single second. I haven't paid a lot of attention to the QB2 battle because in order to really focus in on that, you have to only watch that. And there's too many things that we've been trying to learn at practice, whether it's offense, defense, and we've all been focused on the receivers, that I've been mostly following the receivers. I haven't been following the ball. And and it's in a very important battle. And I think the other thing, Greg, is like I'm very high on what Ethan Grunkemeyer can be. I think he has NFL potential, just like Drew Aller. And not in the sense of they're going to be the same player, but there's a style of play there. There's an arm strength. There's an accuracy. There is a decision-making ability from Grunkemeyer that I've seen that we haven't really gotten to see yet, but has that potential.
Yeah.
But Jackson Smolik he's got a little bit of dog in him. Just there's things I've seen on film from him in high school where the chips are down. You need to make a play, and he made a play coming off a broken collarbone. Like there's just those, I'm trying not to say it factor. I'm trying not to say, all of those cliches, but it is that when you need to make a play, he's got a little bit of that. I'm going to just make the play. It doesn't the situation never seemed too big for him. And he's got that really steady personality, having talked to him a little bit, that I feel like he's made for this. And it's just going to be whether or not, his tools and that ability elevate to the level of Ethan Grunkemeyer and Drew Aller, because from a traits perspective, those guys have the advantage. And if they can match him on that particular side of things, it'll be difficult for Jackson to be, a starter at Penn State, but you feel really good about all 3 players. Like I feel really good about all 3 quarterbacks they have on the roster, that I think they're all starting and quality Big Ten quarterbacks to, the degree in which they have the talent.
Right. A couple questions in the chat here talking about backup quarterbacks. This comes from Steven. Did the kid so he's talking about Drew Pine, who went in the transfer portal from Missouri, where, of course, Bo Prabula went, and is now committed to Bowling Green. Look, I guess maybe. Missouri has not announced a starting quarterback. I think we all assume it will be Bo Prabula taking the first team quarterback reps for Missouri in the fall. Missouri did not announce that yet, though. But I think for Pine, I don't know how much of a jump there is between Missouri and Bowling Green, but it's obviously a step back conference-wise. And so I don't think that was necessarily the main reason why, though I'm sure it was a part of it, to go play for Eddie George at Bowling Green and maybe find an easier path to the field. But just to be clear, no. At least not at this stage. Missouri has not picked a starting quarterback. Again, expect it to be Bo, but we'll have to wait and see. Z-Man says it's very important, the backup quarterback conversation he's talking about. One injury away from needing the backup quarterback again. Yes, 100% true.
Sure.
It just is a matter of For every time you come win a game with your backup quarterback like Bo Prabula, it did at Wisconsin with a big help from a pick six that no one ever remembers in that conversation. There are other instances where having your backup in against the other team's first team defense is just going to put you so far behind things that it doesn't matter. Good news. Yeah, go ahead.
No, Greg, there's two different conversations here. There is, can a backup quarterback get you through the game where you can win the game? And then is your backup quarterback good enough that if your starter is injured for a long time, can you still have the same goals you did to start the year? And so this is the point, is I don't have any real doubt that both of these guys could get Penn State through a game. Depending on the game, obviously, the national championship game, I don't know. But could they get you through Wisconsin again? Yes, I think these guys have a similar talent level to Bo Prabula in terms of spot replacement of Drew Aller. But the point I think that Greg and I are talking about more of and I've laid this out on this particular show before, of if you don't have a guy who's gone through it all, a junior or older, the data says you're not winning the national championship game. You're not getting to it. So if you don't have Drew, do you have a chance? And Penn State, the coaching staff will say yes. They will never give up on that. If we're just going to sit back and be objective and realistic, does a redshirt freshman or a redshirt sophomore who didn't play last year and is essentially a redshirt freshman from an experience standpoint, do they have the chance of winning a national championship? Now you're talking about extreme outliers. And probably not. So to me, I think there's two different conversations about that.
Right. And for Penn State, it's one it never hopes to have, though. If it does, certainly it would tell you it likes Ethan and Jackson as much as, every quarterback in the program. What else would it say, right? And it would just let the chips fall where they do. Again, they have two senior running backs back, which certainly helps a lot in any kind of disadvantageous situation you can find yourself in on offense. So we'll see how that battle plays out. Yeah, remember Iowa when Clifford went down? Yeah,
it's amazing the scars that don't go away.
Right.
It's amazing. And I'm not blaming Penn State fans for bringing up Illinois or bringing up this team is so different in so many different ways from those teams. The depth and the talent on the team, I think, is genuinely just next level, especially at the quarterback position. So yeah, that's the point, Z-Man, is I don't think Iowa is happening with these guys. I don't see any way, because the quality of the recruit, the quality of the quarterback is wildly different than it was with Taquan Robertson and Michael Johnson Jr. Both those guys were project players in their own way. These guys are far from being project players at the position.
All right, let's move to our last Between the Lines segment here. This is James Franklin moving to the defensive side of the ball, talking about where things stand at defensive tackle halfway through spring practice.
Xavier Gilliam has been a guy that's, as you guys saw in the winter workouts, really flashed. He's doing it here as well. The Wafel kid, has done some really nice things. Randy Adarica has been a pleasant surprise for a kid who's still supposed to be in high school. Really a bunch of those guys. Mapoye Cook, we're young. Really after Zane, and then when we get Alonzo back, that will help us with two older guys. And then we got a bunch of young guys. Liam is starting to work back in right now, and he's a big-bodied guy. There's a ton of guys. Cook. There's a ton of guys that are going to be battling. It'll be very, very competitive in my mind. Right now, I think you got everybody knows Zane Durant. Everybody knows Alonzo from last year. And then I think Gilliam, those three guys. And then there's going to be a battle for 4 and 5 between 5 or 6 players. So it'll be very, very competitive.
T. Frank, we've heard a lot from James Franklin and some members of his program this spring, and to me, this was probably the most, I don't want to go as far as saying concerning, but probably the most concerning comment to me as it relates to a position group's depth of the spring. When you're talking about a top 2 that includes a guy who is currently not practicing, and a top 3 that includes a guy who did definitely play some last year at Xavier Gilliam. Yeah. And then you have a bunch of guys battling for the spots behind the 2 guys, one of which was a starter, one of which was until he got hurt, and one of which was not a starter. Just cause for pause, I think, even though it is good news to hear that Xavier Gilliam continues to take a step forward. That was the biggest positive takeaway. Yeah. To me, the biggest negative takeaway is just a numbers game.
Yeah, and this I thought of you immediately, which is why I wanted to have this on the show, is because you have the same thought about the offensive line, right? If you've got 3, you've got none when it comes to a position. So is that how you feel about the D tackle position? I mean, it seems like that is the case. Is this do you think that when you're naming that many names, you don't have an answer? But what James Franklin is saying, there's a lot of guys that we're surprised are viable. So do you buy that?
Yeah, so I think that's the question mark here. A little bit different than the offensive line conversation, where sometimes they say they have 6 or 7 starters, and I ended up, I guess, wrong to some degree on that last year when Nolan Rucci was able to step in for Donko. But still, it's one of those things where if you don't have a guy go down, do you really want to keep rotating guys in? But then you can get into the 17-game season conversation. Anyway, we'll save the offensive line part of this for another day. But when it comes to the defensive tackle spot specifically, I guess the good news is that they feel like they have some guys there who are taking a step forward. The thing to me is just concerning is that they're not experienced guys, right? So you're talking about needing to take pretty big steps from not just the spring practice, but also in preseason camp. Because once you get out there, you might be okay in that dreary non-conference schedule that Penn State has this year, featuring Nevada, FIU, and Villanova. But when Oregon comes to town, are you going to have, assuming Alonzo Ford is healthy and ready to go, then you feel very good about your starters at defensive tackle. Do you have a 2 or 3 deep by then? We know how much Penn State likes to rotate. What ways can they figure out to do that if they don't feel good about their 2 and 3 deep? So to me, it's spring. It's the midway point of spring at that. It's not time to have a full-on panic, but you listen to that answer, and it does just hit you in the face, kind of, that Penn State, to have the best defensive tackle group it wants this year, has some work to do.
Yeah, and
I guess another thought I have is that it does not shock me that when you look at and again, some of this is just fit, some of this is just timing, but Penn State brought in plenty of analysts this offseason. 2 of them, Andrew Jackson and Greg Gattuso, rather, easy for me to say, focus on the defensive line. And I think as many helping hands you can have there certainly is not going to hurt matters this offseason.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that the level of individual detail you can get now with the size of analysts on the field and the coaching staff expanding is it's impressive. Like the way they've structured practice now, especially on the offensive side of the ball, is basically every quarterback gets a coach, and that's pretty impressive. Like the number 2 and the number 3 quarterback in the battle for that backup spot, they're going head to head. Everybody else is in an individual pod so they can work on and get conversation and feedback immediately from a coach.
Right.
And on the defensive side, it's a similar way. You see the DNs left and right, defensive tackles left and right, and like there's so much granular level coaching that I think it is a positive. Here's my problem. I saw PJ Mustipher get injured in early October. Defensive tackle, big-bodied guy, 329 pounds. Everybody is different. Every injury is different. Every recovery process is different. But the position makes me nervous that a guy who was November 23rd, not October 3rd, is when Alonzo Ford was injured. Right. James Franklin is very optimistic, it sounds, in terms of the recovery timeline by the way he spoke about that, of talking about Alonzo Ford being in the top 2. So that makes me reconsider, like maybe he's farther ahead than but I'm just very conservative when it comes to especially big-bodied, explosive athletes, because that's what made Ford great. Was it's not just that he's big, it's not just that he has some of those tools, it's that he was the complete package and was making plays as a guy with length, explosiveness, size, and strength. And so if you take away that explosiveness and there's a tentativeness around the knee, or he just hasn't had a chance to work his body back to where he is that explosive, that usually takes a little bit longer from I can play to I can play at my best. And so it really feels concerning to me. So now I'm questioning that, Greg, I guess. Right. Is like, where do you stand on this if you have an opinion on a timeline of return from an injury like that?
Yeah, I think it's fair no matter what position you play. Certainly when you're talking about the bigger guys and the explosion, things like that, that comes top of mind more so than maybe a receiver with a hand injury or something like that. Those seem easier to come back from in a quicker timeline. And I think too that I'm not saying you, and I'm not saying our listening audience, but just generally speaking, the football community, I think sometimes gets a little. That's what I'm looking for here. We have higher expectations of how quickly guys should come back because we base things off of how quickly NFL players come back.
Yeah,
and forget
exactly.
that it's a whole different ball game and don't get me wrong, most college programs have access to a lot of the same stuff, but it's not at the point where it's exactly the same.
It's not their job. They're not professionally. I think that's the other thing is there is
a whole other conversation we could have. How long do you have?
Yeah, right. And I think maybe part of the positive side of this is that Alonzo Ford is an older player and has that level of maturity as opposed to a young guy. Just because you have the resources doesn't mean you're going to take advantage of them. These are still college dudes.
Right.
Greg, college dudes. Do they eat well? Do they sleep well? Do they drink too much? They're humans. These are regular guys that play football and have abnormal physical skills. So not every one of them comes in as a Max Granville and is like, he told me he was literally dreaming, had dreams about using the facilities, using the tools that they have of getting better, getting stronger, being obsessed to the point that he eats eggs. Not deviled. Is it deviled eggs that he was talking about? I think it was deviled egg. No. What's the hard-boiled eggs?
Yeah.
Eating hard-boiled eggs that he doesn't like because he sees it as a challenge. Some of these guys don't think that way. And so the recovery process and the maturity process are kind of intertwined. And I've gotten off on a total tangent. I just think it's important that people kind of give that perspective of it doesn't always work to the best possible situation because these aren't robots where you just swap out a part. They are, in fact, people.
Right. And so for Penn State, it can only hope that Alonzo Ford recovers well and is ready to roll. And then again, some guys step up. Again, if you want to take the positive part away from this, it's that I am not sure at this time 3 weeks ago, I would have sat here and told you that James Franklin would say on April 8 that Xavier Gilliam has put himself within that top two and separated from some of his teammates in that regard. I mean, if you looked at it's one thing you can say, okay, well, if you look at the depth chart, there's not, what other options were there, right? If they were going to separate someone, it'd be him. At the same time, you still got to go earn it. And it seems like he did. We heard this with receiver endlessly, and nobody really earned it last year. To me, Xavier Gilliam doing that is a pretty big positive for him and for Penn State as this defensive tackle conversation continues to evolve.
For sure. Yeah, I agree.
All right. We are about 43 minutes into this edition of the BWI Live Show. Thanks for being with us. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle, Blue White Illustrated, bluewhiteillustrated.com. The Nittany Lions, as we've said a couple times now, are halfway through spring practice, and that felt like a good time for T. Frank and I to get together, put our heads together, and we'll take your thoughts in the comment section. But get together and tell us what you think of the top three thoughts, things you learned, takeaways, etc. that Penn State that you've learned from us here on the show and over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. T. Frank, let's start with number
3.
I know you didn't think I was going to remember to press that button, but I did. So
I love it. I love it.
All right, lead the way for us, T. Frank.
Yeah, Drew Aller is completely under the radar. I mentioned that I haven't really paid attention too much to the quarterback 2 battle, but I remember just a couple minutes ago that if I didn't have my camera on Drew Aller throwing the football in practice, I was committing a sin for the internet community because we wanted to know every single thing about the quarterback. He's a senior now, and he's kind of in the background. And I think that's kind of a good thing. Now, part of the problem is we're hyper-focusing on the receivers and we're kind of looking at the other end of that equation. But other than maybe questions about Drew and where he can get better and progress, I don't want to say the pressure is off, but the spotlight seems to have broadened to the passing game, not just the quarterback and the quarterback's failures. Now, the internet, the comment section, that hasn't changed. But I think the broader conversation of the passing game, especially this spring, has changed from quarterback's fault to offensive system-wide issues. And maybe I'm giving too much credit to us, the people talking about it as opposed to the general consensus. But I think that's a good thing in terms of the shifting and broadening the view of the offensive passing game and passing system.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Drew Aller comes into this spring as a guy who is seen by most as one of the top quarterbacks in the country, obviously with good reasons, strong Heisman odds, things like that. And even though it comes up every week, how can he improve? How can he take the next step? So on and so forth. You're right. I think he is flying a little bit under the radar, whether that's because Tyler Warren's no longer with this Penn State team, whether it's because everyone is rightly focused on what Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton can do. It is a little bit interesting that it feels like he, as a very successful fourth-year quarterback who just led his team to the college football playoff, is a little bit under the, under the radar is the perfect way to put it. Yeah. So that is pretty interesting to observe, and I agree. My number 3 was young guys that are getting extra reps must make the most of them. So if you go watch James Franklin's video news conferences here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel from both 2 weeks ago and this past week, he talked about Tamir Robinson getting more work because Tony Rojas is currently limited right now. 2 weeks ago, he talked about with Nolan Rucci and Anthony Donko both a little limited right now, the reps that Javen Williams is getting that he wouldn't have been getting before. And those aren't the only 2 examples. They're just the 2 that we've heard James Franklin talk about because he was asked about those guys. But there's more of them. And to me, those guys seem to be taking the reps they're getting and running with them. So the third thought, point, takeaway, thing I've learned, whatever, is it can't just be those guys. And the defensive tackle,
D-end, I think, is another one. Denied and Sutton hasn't been out there. I don't know if he was out there yesterday. I didn't see him, but I wasn't looking. So there's young guys at that position getting a lot of reps too.
Right. And so, we have some young receivers or newcomer receivers in the same boat. So to me, it seems like it's so far so good on that front, and we've learned some positives with those kinds of players. And we'll have to see if more of those continue to pop up throughout the rest of the month. But certainly, I think if you're going to spend a lot of your spring talking about the mix between development and getting some guys some veteran days and veteran reps and things like that those guys have to take advantage of it. Some have, more will, and we'll continue to talk about that. But let's get to number 2, T. Frank.
Number 2.
I thought this was an interesting one for you, so I'm going to let you roll with it.
So I got to be careful here, but I think that, and I've mentioned this here on the show, I talked to Danny O'Brien last night because I wanted to know what is the offensive personality this year, because offenses have to evolve every single year. If you do the exact same thing you did last year, everyone's going to be ready for it. So what are the tweaks, changes? What's the personality going to be like? And his answer was building on what we did well from last year, doing that, enhancing that, and then playing off of those things to create an offense that has complementary pieces. And so I have observed some of the things that they're doing, and I think that they speak to Andy Kotelnicki having a better understanding of his personnel in year 2. And not to say that he didn't have an understanding of his personnel in year 1, but a deeper level of understanding. And here's a problem with creativity, because I try to have creative bits, segments. I try to make up all the things you see here on the show. I try to have fun with these things. You can't force creativity. It happens when it happens. You can't manufacture it. And a lot of times what it takes is time. It takes the ability of one thought to collide with another that are seemingly completely different and have nothing in common with each other. And I think just over time, good coordinators, like I think Jim Knowles is one of these guys, part of the conversation about what we're going to talk about next, is that they are able to take what they did, learn from the mistakes, and craft something better in the second iteration. And I am noticing things that, at least early on, make me optimistic that the Penn State offense will be more efficient and resilient this year, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think that that's good news for Penn State, because we talk about under the radar when we have so much to talk about with Jim Knowles and all new stuff on defense. The offense as a whole, not just Drew Aller, is flying a little bit under the radar. One thing that's not, though, and it's my number 2 on this list, is the impact Stan Drayton can have on playing, getting Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton to a different level. We know he was hired for that. We talked earlier in the show about the good things that we have heard and seen about that transition and that progress. And then James Franklin's comments last night were kind of the icing on the cake for me in the proverbial sense. So I do think that if you were, and it's not a surprise, right? Like, these guys are hard workers. They always put in the extra time, the extra effort. They're willing to be taught and coached and so on and so forth. So this is no great shock. But it still has to happen. And man, T. Frank, everything I've heard, learned, and otherwise so far tells me that they are on the right track to make that happen, to be better versions of themselves. And they're already pretty darn good, successful guys already.
Yeah, I agree. I'm optimistic about that. I'd say that the part that I'm most focused on is, can you get Nick Singleton to expand his worldview? Because Nick is very successful because he's super consistent and he's a bit tunnel visioned in terms of like lifting, football. Like, there's a very specific personality and skill set there. Can you add in that creative element? Can you unlock whatever depth of that he has? Some guys, the mental elasticity to do that, especially, when he's in his early 20s, there's still tons of time for him to develop. But certain personalities struggle with it more than others. And so I would bet that Nick can do it, because Nick has not failed at anything he's done in his life as far as we've seen. But it is that there is a personality thing there that I'm curious about. I want to watch that development.
Yeah. And so those two guys making another step would be obviously huge for the Penn State offense. Before we get to number one, I'm just going to check anything that we have going on in the chat here on this topic.
Let's get to Levi in the mailbag. Yeah, let's get to Levi's question in the mailbag. It's a good question. We'll get to that in a second.
All right. Well, before we get to that, we got to get to number one on our list of things we've learned about Penn State at the halfway point of spring.
Number one.
And you're going to start with some focus on Jim Knowles, T. Frank.
Yeah, kind of the coordinators. That's my bread and butter, is looking at the big picture and seeing how all the chess pieces are moving around. So James Franklin, I went back and I listened to his season spring practice opening press conference last week, just because I wanted to mentally refresh myself on the starting point as we got here closer to the middle point. And he mentioned multiple times defensive installation being critical, making sure these guys were understanding the process and they were able to integrate everything really well. And so I asked him about that yesterday. How's it going? And compared to what you've had to do this couple times, how's the install going in terms of efficiency and making everything go as smoothly as you want? And he was very happy with it. He not only he pointed out the fact that Jim Knowles is a career defense coordinator who's done this a bunch of times at Duke,
right,
at I think Georgia Tech,
Oklahoma State,
and Ohio State. And so he's done this a bunch of times, and he has the understanding of how to not just fit it to the personnel, but install a defense and teach it from the ground up. And on top of that, they're similar enough that, and they've done it enough that it's been super efficient, and it's created good competition where the offense, which is advanced at this point in the season, being in year two, they are being competitive. And so I think if you're worried about Penn State taking a step back on defense, talent-wise, I think there's a fair argument where you might just get beat, but you shouldn't expect a step back from the overall defense. In fact, I think you could take a step forward in terms of the first year of the defensive coordinator with less missed assignments, less broken plays, less coverage busts, and play a cleaner brand of football. That's absolutely on the table. And if you do that, you might end up in the same place as where you were last year, even without an Abdul Carter, which I'm not saying they're going to get there, but it's on the table for that to happen because of what Jim Knowles and the defense is able to do.
Yeah, certainly a fair expectation for this Penn State team in 2025. My list of things we've learned at halfway point. I can't imagine the start of spring going a whole lot better for Penn State. Obviously, they would like some of the guys we've talked about who are not yet ready to go to be out there, but it's been pretty ho-hum otherwise, and I think you prefer your spring to be exactly like that. Everyone seems to be in a good mood. James Franklin, when he talks, is in a pleased state of mind about where the competition is and where the practices are and things like that. We have not yet heard or seen of any new injury issues. That doesn't mean they're not going on behind the scenes, but we haven't seen them, which is a plus. I just think it was a good start to spring practice for Penn State because it was fairly quiet, fairly routine. And I think that's all you can ask for in 2025 when you are about to have the transfer portal open and this, that, and the other thing going on. The more routine and normal time you can have, the better. And I know that may not last in the second half of spring practice, and we'll be having a different conversation maybe in 2 weeks. But for me, number one on the list at the halfway point, so far so good. Can Penn State keep it that way? We'll see.
Yeah, and Greg, just to kind of underline this, think back to the conversation about the receivers. Think back to the conversation about defensive install in the past or competition between the two sides. James Franklin has not been shy about voicing his displeasure about certain things within the spring practice as we've gone through it in the past. And so I think you make a great point that he's been in a great mood. he's been pretty happy so far this spring, and that probably is a good barometer of the progress they've been making.
All right, we got about 5 minutes left on this edition of BWI Live. And with those 5 minutes, you know that music. It means that BWI mailbag is open. We had one in the, let's start with the one in the comment section here, T. Frank, and then we will get to our pre-selected questions from BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Levi asked, would Penn State rather have an old school middle linebacker run stuffer or more new school middle linebacker that plays more coverage and sideline to sideline?
Yeah, so it's a 4-2 defense with a nickel base package, and in that you are asking players to cover more space. So in a sense, you need to have a blend. I think you still need to have a little bit of beef in the middle, but you're asking those linebackers to be coverage players. Right. So I would say you're looking for more of that complete player than a guy who skews towards, I'm going to be a thumper in the middle. And coverage is so important. Like that's what I guess I'm trying to underline. So old school middle linebacker, no, not an old school middle linebacker. You want a guy that can do it all. And philosophically, I think you should want that no matter what defense you run. The less weaknesses you have, the less ways offenses can expose those weaknesses. So if you can recruit a guy who's 235 pounds, hits like a dump truck, and can run, do that one. Do that plan. And a guy in a team like Penn State that is LBU should be able to do that. So I think that that's the plan for Jim Knowles' system is you have to maintain 6 in the box as your base defense, but in that, coverage is super important because you're trying to suffocate passing by having only 6 in the box. That's the whole point, is dedicate bodies to coverage, and that includes linebackers.
All right, next up on our list of questions, I need to just verify what I'm looking at is what question we're going to go to. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at me like, what is this guy talking about? Yeah.
Sorry about that.
All right, no, you're good. I was just making sure I was in the right part of the admin. That's how we do it live on air, folks. You'll always know the tricks of the trade and our little, we don't keep anything from you. So, all right, YG asked, I have not heard much about Caden Saunders and Liam Clifford. Is this just because we kind of know what we're getting with them, or is it possible they may actually get passed up by some of these guys? Question, obviously talking about everyone's favorite topic, T. Frank, the receivers room.
Yeah, so it's both. We do know Liam Clifford has been the same guy for a couple of years now in terms of what to expect from him. We know from a physical standpoint, from a route running perspective, there's no new ground there. Caden Saunders, a bit of a still, he's been injured enough, he's been out there enough that we have a good idea of who he is. And we're getting a better idea seeing some of these one-on-ones where the strengths and weaknesses are in real, like, big relief between good and bad with Caden Saunders. But yeah, the answer is absolutely anyone can get past. The point we made on the Tuesday show yesterday, go check that out, is they are not, the gloves are off. The feelings brigade is done. If you are not producing, you can be replaced. And they want to have a certain amount of consistency out there. So I don't think Liam Clifford is coming off the field completely. He provides too many good soft skills on the field. But if they need a receiver to catch the football and he's not the guy that's going to get open, yeah, Kobe Howard, Tysier Denmark, Anthony Ivy, any of these guys can leapfrog anyone on the depth chart. I firmly believe that's the case this year.
All right, 2 more questions, 2 more minutes, so we'll get right to the next one. It comes from CJ Philly, who asked, do you get the sense that James Franklin and his staff are going a little more tough love with Drew Aller? Don't know if I'm phrasing that right, but maybe holding him a bit more accountable and lighting a fire for him to play best when they need him to. Your thoughts, T-Frank?
No, I'd say the exact opposite. So I talked to Danny O'Brien, and watching Drew on film, there is nobody that's going to hold Drew Aller more accountable for his mistakes than Drew. And so I asked O'Brien, is there a case of wanting it too bad? He wants it too much, where maybe he starts to press or he tries to make too many plays. And Danny O'Brien said, yeah, pretty much. Like that's he talked about knowing when to be the thermostat and not having to always turn the temperature up to 120 degrees. You need to pick your spots and know how to be that guy. And I think it's the exact opposite in terms of they're not protecting Drew, and they are saying everyone needs to get better, but I would disagree. I'd say the tough love conversation is about the receivers, not the quarterback.
All right, last one for today's episode. Poncho 570 asked, it's not going to be murderer's row the first 3 games. He's talking about the Penn State non-conference schedule, of course. How many reps do you see the starters getting to get used to the offensive defensive scheme versus how many developmental game reps do you see for the backups during each of those games, considering the bye that follows Oregon coming to town after the non-conference schedule?
The problem is I don't know how much they're going to know about their system at this point. So the defensive side of the ball, you got to get these guys game reps so that they can't get rusty in the first month of the season. So if you're coming off of training camp and then 3 games of non-competition, you can't then ratchet it up to 100 against Oregon. So they're
coming out of a bye, no less. Yeah.
Right. They're going to need to get their reps. They're going to need to make sure that the offense and defense are working efficiently. And he's right. He also says in that post that came with it, like, it's going to be very vanilla. They have the opportunity to do what Michigan did a couple years ago, which is to basically play just their base offense with absolutely no wrinkles and go into the game against Oregon. Andy Kolnicki, though, his base offense is wrinkles. So maybe you'll see everything and it'll be chaotic and there'll be all these things. But I think they need to work through those details and make sure that when there's live ammunition, they are hitting their targets. So it's not going to be a vacation for Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, Nittany, and all the starters.
Again, I think in a perfect world, this doesn't matter if you're playing a Big Ten game or a non-conference game. If you can get your starters out somewhere middle of the way through the third quarter, towards the end of the third quarter, and give other players on the roster who have earned the right to be on the game field the chance to play in the fourth quarter, I think that's your perfect. And, again, if there's a game where you can do it at halftime, fine. Those aren't always going to exist. Yeah. But, again, it's not – I would encourage everyone not to necessarily focus. I know it's a low level of opponent Penn State has for these non-conference games for the most part. But I think that if you can get your guys out after a drive or 2 in the third quarter, no matter who you're playing, you should be in pretty good shape, and that would be a good day and a good win for Penn State. If
you have 65 plays in a game, you want to get your starters 40, 42, and then the rest, 20 snaps for the backups. I think that's a good split of, the lion's share still going to the starters, but 20 reps for your backups is still a really good day of work for those guys to kind of work through the competition and the depth.
All right. Well, that's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle. This has been BWI Live from BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Go check us out. It's $1 for 1 week of access over on the site for all the insight from practice and anything else you may be missing as the spring unfolds. Don't forget, T. Frank, Ryan, Sean, back with the recruiting show on Thursday, and we'll have everything else covered for you both here and at BWI. BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll catch you next time.